Roman history. Now, I don't do this because I believe the Wikipedia version, the common version, that if it wasn't for the Romans, the Mishnah never would have gotten written, as you'll soon see what I'm talking about. But it is important to understand what's going on in the rest of the world. It wasn't important to talk about what the Chinese were doing in Moses' time. You know, while Moses was sitting here hitting the rock, they were inventing firecrackers. Okay, why do I need to know this? I mean, it's not something that, I mean, it's interesting, especially 4th of July, I'm thankful, but it's not really something that is relevant for my personal development. I don't need to know about it. But when you're talking about in Roman times, where the rabbis are working hand in hand, either for or against the Roman leadership in Rome, now I need to know something about what's going on in Rome. Now, I mentioned also briefly last time that Roman history has been the subject of fascination of all modern historians. We know an awful lot about Roman history. A lot of it's fabricated. We all know this. A lot of it's fabricated. Whoever is the one who wins the war gets to write and rewrite the history. But be that as it may, it's one of the most clearly documented parts of ancient history would be Roman history. And it's just shocking that such an insignificant people, the Jews, would have anything to do with it. Because let's face it, the Jewish height ended with the Greeks and the 70 to 100 year period of the Greeks. The Romans went on for 400 or 500 years, and the Holy Roman Empire went on for about another 500 or 600 years. And so there's really, of all of the great countries and the wars and this, that, and the other, the Jews played virtually no role as far as secular historians are concerned. But in terms of the Mishnah, we'll see there is an intersection. So I'm going to work towards that as well. So I'm going to jump back and forth. I want to conclude today with some of the personalities because it gets us to understand a little bit better the mindset of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, Rabbi Judah the Prince, who was the compiler according to one opinion, or the author according to the other opinion, and we'll get to that in a few minutes, of the Mishnah. It helped you to understand what was going on in the world and how it led him to the Mishnah.
So one question, the Jewish population in Rome, I remember reading, was like 10%.
Well, after the destruction of the first temple, when everybody went to Babylon, a lot of people didn't stay in Babylon. They only, because they were so welcome there.
After the first time.
I'm saying, because they were so welcome there, most of them stayed there. But the truth of the matter was, many of them, I mean, they stayed there because Aramaic was very close to Hebrew, and they wanted the Jewish people with open arms. They were good for accountants and this and that and all kinds of skilled trades and so on. But many of them didn't stay in Babylon for long. Many of them moved upwards and leftwards, all the way to Portugal and Spain and so forth, during these 300 or 400 years. Absolutely. And in fact, the Babylon, of course, as we know, by Vuha de Shmuel's father, became really rivaling the level of scholarship with Israel itself. And we also know simultaneously, because of what we mentioned last time after Alexander, that when the rabbis didn't give the right answer, Alexandria was created, and many Jews, 100,000 Jews overnight, were exiled to Alexandria for not being willing to translate not the one in Megillah, not the story in the Megillah, but 70 years beforehand, when they refused the first Ptolemy, after Alexander's request to translate the Bible, they were sent to Alexander as punishment, Alexandria. So Egypt also became a major area. So Egypt and Morocco was one area. The main area was Babylon, and after that was Egypt and Morocco. But then the rest of them were already in Germany. There were communities in Germany. There were communities in Portugal, communities in Spain, and so forth. No, so by the second Churban, it was a horse of a different color. By now, two things happened. All of the sages were let out. All of the strong men were let out. The upper class were left out. The farmers didn't go anywhere. 95% of the people who owned a farm never were. There was a war. There wasn't a war. The Romans came. The Romans didn't come. Had nothing to do with them. They were not. The Romans wanted you to pay taxes. The people that could pay taxes were the farmers. They were the only ones that had stuff, and so it didn't really affect them. So the people that left were the non-farmers, and so they were the merchants. And by now, the communities in Western Europe were already well established, and therefore the Jews went there immediately. And of course, because Constantine was already the boss, anti-Semitism already began, and of course the history continues from there. But that's off of us. We skipped ahead too many years. So let's go back. The problem was the difference after the second destruction, which leads us to the Mishna and the first destruction. In the first destruction, they were welcomed in Babylon. The second destruction, they weren't welcomed in the far western parts of Europe, because although Christianity hadn't arisen yet, the Roman rule did. And wherever you went, if you put two pennies together, the Romans assumed that you were trying to foment some kind of revolution, and so they had all of their minions, and all of the emperors had generals fighting wars in Germany, fighting wars in England, fighting wars and so if the Jews were in the way, they were crushed. So this was different. Here, the Jews had to be individual. Here, the Jews had to live on their own. There was no safe community to go to. They had to live on their own. In any case, so as we know, that Vespasian was the one we mentioned last time. I'm not going to go through the details again. Vespasian was the one that softened the blow with the help of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, but his son Titus took over, and Titus was not friendly. Although there's a Gemara that says that actually he didn't destroy the temple; he was going to let it go. But Princess Bernice was very upset. She wanted a trophy, damn it! And so she said, "You cannot leave the house standing, because how did we win? How can we show we won? I want to have a trophy." Of course, we have the early stories of Rav Gamliel of Yavne going to speak to him, which my voice carries. So I don't want to interrupt your clients. We should probably close the door. So there were a number of stories in the Gemara where, along with Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua, that Rav Gamliel, the young, would be on his way to Rome. And one time he was on his way to Rome to beseech Titus, because Titus really wasn't such a bad guy, comparatively speaking. But he found out that Titus had died and Domitian was in charge. And Domitian was just simply born an anti-Semite. He just hated Jews. And so they just stopped in their tracks. They didn't bother to go. It wasn't worth it. We're up to now about the year 90. We're moving quickly to the big year of 180. We're getting there. We're only 90 years away. So we've traveled now 400 years in 2 months. So if we can just beg your patience a little while longer. The next emperor was Nerva. He had a 2-year emperorship from the year 96 to 98 of the Common Era. And like most of the Romans prior to Constantine, they didn't care about the Jews. In fact, in a way, they loved the Jews. And the reason why was everyone cheated on their taxes. Nobody had the money. There was always an excuse. Whatever number that you would invent, the Jews got it and they paid it. And they never missed a paycheck. They never missed the tax payment, ever. Because the Jews didn't want to, because the way it worked was you paid taxes and you could stay. If you didn't pay taxes, in order not to foment revolution, you would be transplanted. Well, the Jews didn't want to go anywhere. So whatever proconsul that was given by the governor to the toilet boil of the world, which was Israel, that nobody wanted until the 6-Day War. Nobody wanted it. There was never a Palestinian that wanted to live there while the Turks had it. Not a one. But the Jews wanted it. So when the proconsul would be sent there, he figured he got 1 year. Normally he had 1 year to squeeze money out of people, and then you can go back and get on the Senate of Rome. But this was such a poor country, you had to be there 2 years, which was just, I think the Europeans call it that shitty country. That's where they had to, that's the common phrase for Israel amongst the people of the world. So no proconsul wanted to be there. So not 2 years. So what did you do? He would double the taxes. The Jews paid it. Didn't matter what it was, where they got the money, how they got it, whatever. So in Rome, they never had to let's go get the Third Legion and send them to Israel. Let's go get some Italians and break their actors. Rome, they have Italians. This is not stereotype. Let's go get a couple of Italian guys and go break their legs to get their money. They didn't have to do that. Why? Because the Jews were giving the money already. There was one country you didn't have to worry about, so they weren't really against it. And they really weren't. They weren't like Greece. They didn't know what your beliefs were. They didn't care because they didn't have any beliefs, and they didn't care. So why would they care about your beliefs? As long as it wasn't nationalistic, gesundheit, they didn't care.
So which time period are you speaking?
I'm up to you. Well, that's
after the Churban?
Well, no, this is after the Churban, and this is all up to the Battle of Beitar, and it started up again. We talked about Beitar last month, but in any case, so Nerva came along, and he said, "You know what? This is ridiculous. There is a 2 drachma tax given for just being Jewish." And I told this story when I lived on the Chaldees farm last time, didn't I?
I don't think so.
I didn't tell that story? Okay, so I'll briefly
you
tell.
did. You
I
did
did
tell-
tell the
yeah,
story,
you
then I'm
did
not
tell
going to
I
tell it.
don't know it.
I'll say it briefly for those who weren't.
Okay.
So if I worked for Mrs. Gertner, which was Golden Flow, which is a kosher Chalav Yisrael a company in New York. And so she sent me to Lowell, New York, upstate New York, to be the supervisor of a kosher milk dairy farm. And it was a huge dairy farm with 1,000 cows. 1,000 cows. I had 4 milkings in a 24-hour period, every day, including Yom Kippur. And so I went there. And when I arrived with a suitcase in my hand, and there was a little cottage there at on the property, and the veterinarian who owned the farm happened to be driving by, and he stopped, and basically he said, "Who the heck are you?" And I said, "Well, I'm the supervisor. It was arranged, and he said, "Well, of course." He says, "Why are you here?" I'm not asking you. Why are you on my property is what I want to know. I said, "Well, this is where the cows are." And he said, "Well, fine. The next milking is at 2 o'clock. See you." And I said, "Well, why do you have your suitcase?" I said, "Well, I'm supposed to. I was told Mrs. Gertner that I'm supposed to stay here." And he said, "On my property?" "Well, that's where the cows are." "Yeah, on your property." And he said, "I'm not having a Jew on my property." This was 1976. "I'm not having a Jew on my property." I said, "Why not?" He said, "Well, first of all," he said, general reasons, general purposes. I mean, what insane man would want to have a Jew on his property? But number 2, he says, "Do you know that my wife is trying to become the president of the Ladies' Flower Society? You know, they grow these flowers." I said, "So? If they find out that there's a Jew on the property, there's no way they would elect her."
Really?
Yeah, and so forth. I said, "Get out of here." She said, "Go to a hotel, and and I'll be in touch." So I called Mrs. Gertner. I said, "What do I do?" And so she called the Satmar Dayan, the chief rabbi of the Satmar, who gave the hechsher, and said, "Not allowed to have a Jew on the property." So the Satmar Dayan said, was a smart guy. He said, what he's telling you is that, there needs to be, if there's a damage, there needs to be, what do you call it, the legal term if you...
A fee.
Security deposit.
Not a security deposit. If you damage something,
Recovery?
Recovery, is that the word? I don't know.
Compensation?
Tort. What is it?
Tort, yeah.
Is that what it is? You're the expert. I'm looking at you for a reason. What's it called when somebody has to pay restitution? Is restitution? Is that it?
Restitution, pay damages, compensation.
Compensation, right. So the Dayan said he's asking for compensation because he's taking a hit socially for having a Jew on his property. So call him back up and Mrs. Gertner and find out what. And so they bargained that, and so they decided that having a Jew living on the property would be 1/10 of a penny per pound of milk. No, 1/100th of a penny per pound of milk, which basically the guy got an extra $2,000 of pocket money every month by having the social disgrace of having a Jew. Anyway, so that's what Nero said. There was a 2 drachma tax on every Jew because you were Jewish. And part of the pro-council was he had to go live amongst these shirotzim. And so Nerva said, "Why are we doing this? These people pay their taxes." And so he did away with the 2 drachma tax, minted a coin that said in the legend on there, "The shame of the Jewish tax has been removed." They did it not in Hebrew, they did it in Latin. It was a Latin logo, that sublata, it has been removed from us. The shame of the Jewish tax has been removed. So if you wanted to be Jewish, that's fine. Just don't end up trying to have a revolution. That's all we care about. We don't care what you do. He died, unfortunately, and Trainius took over, also known as Trajan. Now, this is a mixed bag. First of all, for the first 5 years, he was pretty close to the Jewish people, meaning that he was following Nerva's approach. There's a Gemara about him where, as a military person, he was trying to shore up his southern flank. And so he found himself in Israel, in the southern Levant, and he saw some of the customs that the Jews were doing, and he thought, well, that's meaningful, because he came from a life that was bereft of meaning. And so when he saw some of the things that the Jewish people did, like, for example, when people died, they mourned them. In Rome, when people died, they blew the trumpets, and they shot the guns in the air. They didn't have guns, but, and they made a l'chaim. The guy's dead, l'chaim. But the Jewish people, they had a shroud, a burial shroud, mourning, and this, that, and the other. There was this guy's dead. Why do you have respect for him? So they saw that he saw that the Jewish people had certain things that he really liked, and so forth. The problem is, being a military leader, he felt like he needed to consolidate because the Parthians were always chepping with the Romans. Actually, they never, to be fair, the Parthians never once started up with the Romans. Every attack of the Parthians was a response to some Roman general, instead of going that way to Germany or to England to sow his oats, he had to go this way towards India and start up with the Parthians. And every time they did this, it was like a border war. So the Romans would go over here, and the Parthians would fight them back. In fact, the Romans never lost a war except the Parthians. They didn't lose it; they just didn't win it. And so he was thinking, eventually he would, want to go and do like the Parthians. After all, it shouldn't be just Alexander the Great 4 centuries earlier who could conquer the whole world. I'm not chopped liver. I should also be able to do it. Well, that means going this way. And so if I have to go this way, he said, I need to make sure that what my southern flank is all consolidated. So for that reason alone, he started to harp down on the Jewish people. He started to restrict them from doing various things. So in the year 114, this is now after Rabbi Gamliel of Yavne has died. Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah went back and retook the leadership again. He had a lieutenant under him whose name was Quietus. He was the one that was given the task of making sure that the Jews don't start aiding the Parthians, because Jews had moved everywhere. Because the Jews had been in Babylonia now for 500 years, and although many of them went... No, that's the next country over. So even though many of them went this way, some of them went that way. And the problem is they all sent money to Jerusalem. They all sent money to Jerusalem. And so he just wanted to make sure that if I'm going this way, I don't want their relatives over here sending money to him over here. So he sent Quietus down there to make sure that, make up something. We don't care. Make up something and make sure that the Jews...
What do they care if the Jews get money on the contract so they can tax them and that's it?
No. That the Jewish people in Parthia are sending money to their relatives in Jerusalem or in Israel. Good. And the problem is that if once Quietus would begin the war going towards this way, the people in Jerusalem would say, wait a second, those are our people they're attacking. And so what they would do is they would now come from the southern flank and attack the Romans. So this was their strategy before the whole thing started. So in 116, the Parthians counterattacked and they were successful. And Quietus now was very embarrassed. He was very upset. And so what did he do? He started to execute the Jews, because they were helpless, and that's who he wanted to defeat. A very quick story that's told in the Gemara Tainus. There were two brothers, and Quietus wanted to put them to death, and so he wanted to make fun of them. And he said, I remember about Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, the 3 compatriots of Daniel, that when they were thrown into the fire by Nebuchadnezzar, they came out unharmed. The Bible story. The compatriots of Daniel, the book of Daniel. So he said to these two brothers, Quietus said to these two brothers, look, I'm going to see if that's going to work with you. I'm going to take the two of you and I'm going to throw you into the dungeon and see what happens. And they said, we have 2 problems. I said, what? First of all, Nebuchadnezzar was a real leader. You are somebody's lieutenant. And second of all, they were righteous people. We're just 2 regular Jews. So you shouldn't think, first of all, you're not worthy of a miracle. And second of all, neither are we. Meantime, he executed them. But a year later, as Trajan was retreating from the Parthians, he died. And unfortunately, we go from the pan to the fire. Who took over? Hadrian. The first thing Hadrian did was what you always do. You always put to death all the rest of the generals. So he killed Quietus, he killed everybody else, and so forth and so on. Now, Hadrian was like Trajan initially in the same way. He didn't have a problem with the Jews initially. He had a problem with the generals and people who were pretenders to the throne. So he also, as a military leader, wanted to shore up the southern Levant. So he also went to go and visit. And and at this time, I think he met Rabbi Yehoshua. He met Rabbi Yehoshua because Rabbi Yehoshua had always accompanied Rabbi Gamliel to go to Rome to release the Jews from all these terrible decrees. So he met him, And when you start talking about Judaism, you have to understand that not only the common people, but even those that were charged, were getting tired already. This is already the beginning of the 2nd century, the common. They're getting tired of bloodthirst, of blood sport. They were getting tired of it. And people were starting to convert to Judaism because they were the only people that had ever been conquered by the Romans that would never stay down. They never got conquered. Everybody else disappeared. Everybody else, the Assyrians, everybody else disappeared. They don't exist anymore. And so people admired the Jewish people. It's like in today, certain people start to acquire customs of people that are prejudiced against or biased against. I think they call it cultural appropriation. People begin to take on certain characteristics, styles of clothing and hairstyles and so on, of the people who are downtrodden, the people that have been dumped on for such a long time. In any case, the point is that people who are constantly attacked, but they still managed to exist and stay alive. So people started to admire it. And so, like Trajan, so did Hadrian. So he went to Rabbi Yeshua and he said, I want you to come visit me. He said, I can't. He said, why not? He says, because you don't keep kosher. And he says, so bring your cooks with you. And he said, fine. So he brought his cooks. And he was there over a Shabbos. And they were eating something. And Hadrian said to him, this is the best thing I ever tasted. What is this thing called? He said, it's called cholent. And he said, this is tremendous. This is great. So then he left, and so he commanded his royal cooks to make cholent on a Wednesday. And he spat it out. It's disgusting. I mean, cholent is a hobo stew. The rabbis invented it because they wanted you to have warm food on the Sabbath to enjoy the Sabbath, but you're not allowed to kindle a fire. So cholent is a way of cooking the food before Shabbos and leaving it on the fire without being able to stir it or stir the coals or anything like that. And so this is called cholent. So he had his people make a hobo stew. No king eats a hobo stew. There's a reason why they call it a hobo stew. A king wouldn't touch that with a 10-foot pole or a 7-foot check. And so in any case, he got angry. So he sent a letter to Yoshua, and he said, Rabbi Yoshua, and he said, oh, what happened here? This stuff is disgusting. So he said, you're missing a spice. And he said, well, sell me something. He said, well, I can't. It's not for sale. And he said, well, how can it not be for sale? What's the spice? He says, it's the Sabbath. He said, even by us, we don't eat it during the week. I remember one stop, the kosher store, they don't have it anymore, but I remember like 10 or 15 years ago, they had this can. And I looked at it, walked by, and I stopped, and I came back and looked at it again. I said, what? Cholent. They were selling canned cholent. I mean, can you imagine? I mean, have you ever had cholent? It's the worst tasting. I mean, it's terrible. During the week. On Shabbos, it's great. That Hadrian pretty much let them do what they wanted to do. And so over a period of time, they did, this is the Bar Kokhba revolution, about the year 122, there were freedoms. It was an independent country, Israel, because they paid their taxes, and so they were independent, but they were like a serfdom or whatever. They were independent per se, but they couldn't rule on capital punishment, but they could do everything else, and so forth. But unfortunately, thanks to our good friends, the Samaritans, which is why the Christians call them good Samaritans, because they would always go and try to start up with the Romans. And they would go to the Romans and say, you know what, they're sending the money from Parthia to their brethren in Jerusalem, not because it's a barren land they can't live, because they're stockpiling AK-47s. They're going to start a revolution, you mark my words. And the Samaritans started chapping. That's when I told you the story last time. And they said, the Samaritans said, prove my word. They were called good because they're anti-Semites. That's why they were good. And so what did they say? They said, we'll prove it to you. This is what you need to go do. Go and ask them that this new temple that they want to build that they're talking about. I'm telling you it's a military fortress and it's built to military specifications. And I'll prove it to you, the Samaritan said. Go and ask him to arbitrarily change this room by 2 inches. Well, of course, if you did that, the bazookas won't fit in that room. I want you to put a wooden floor there instead of a concrete steel reinforced floor. Well, because I can't do that because that's where the tanks are going to be. I mean, you can't go into a military fortress and start just move. So the Samaritans said, "Go, you'll see. You'll ask them to move things 1 inch and they won't do it." That's proof that it's not if it's just a temple, a house of prayer, what do you care? It's facing this way, it's facing that way, it's this high, it's that high. What do you care? So Hadrian said, okay, it's hard to believe, but I'm sure they'll do whatever I say. So he went in and he said, oh, they made such a big to-do? It was like this was the word. It was like the Holocaust. You want move it 1 inch? Oh, are you out of your mind? And so forth and so on. So it became fairly clear to the Romans that this is a military fortress. This was the time period, according to Rabbi Meir, looking back, where it became accustomed to say the Shema silently. We have a custom of saying the Shema quietly. According to Rabbi Meir, the reason why was because when the Romans would ever hear, they'd say, they don't know who this General Hashem is. There was some general named Hashem. They said, "Hear, O Israel, Hashem is our God. No, Hadrian is. I don't know who the Hashem guy is, but you got it wrong. So in order they shouldn't mistake who their leader was, people used to say, start saying the Shema quietly, according to Rabbi Meir. Anyway, I'm skipping over the Bar Kokhba revolt in 133 because we talked about it last time. So now by the year 139, Hadrian's dead. And what happened was, for temporarily was Rufus the doofus. He took over. He was an anti-Semite. When Rome found out that he was still persecuting the Jews, and they said, for what? We just had the Battle of Beitar. You had over 1 million Jews were killed. The place was running with blood. There is no revolution. I don't care what your excuse are, but don't tell me there's a revolution. There can't be a revolution. Because the real reason was this. If you say there's a revolution, this would say to the world, we didn't kill enough Jews. That we were not really strong enough. The Jews must have somehow survived. This would be a slap in the face to the Roman reputation. And so they said, there is no such thing as a possible revolution that's going to come. And so they recalled Rufus, and we never hear about him again. Antoninus takes over. Antoninus Pius takes over. This is the year 161. At this point, you know the story that I mentioned last week about Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was hiding in a cave with his son. When Antoninus Pius took over, he said, no more with the Jews. Now, don't get me wrong. This is the Roman Empire. As soon as Constantine comes and we start with the Holy Roman Empire, then all the persecutions are going to increase by 10-fold, by 20-fold. But before that happens, due to the Christians, before that happens, so Antoninus Pius takes over. This is now in the year 150s and 160s, and times started to be good for the Jews. They were considered to be defanged, and there's nothing Rome needs to fear from the Jewish people. And so by this time, we said last time that Rabbi Shimon Ben Yochai was able to leave the cave, which is a euphemism for the Jewish people could start to learn Judaism openly. They could teach Judaism openly. The whole story of the cave was to say that you can do it in full frontal view, that there is no repercussions for doing this. Unfortunately, Rome decided once again to attack Parthia. And parts of it up to Armenia were conquered. But in the year 148, Vologases III took it back from Antoninus Pius, and he started the counterattack on Antoninus Pius. And unfortunately, Antoninus Pius died. Now the Jews were worried, we're going to start up with this again. But, and now we start with the history, although I'm going to talk about a few more personalities. Now we talk about the history that makes the conditions right for Rabbi Judah the Prince. The one who takes over is Marcus Aurelius Antoninus. Now, we're going to debate this later about historically how is that possible, but for now, we're going to say it was Marcus Aurelius Antoninus. He starts off not as a good ruler, because he said, you know, Rome is too big for one man. I'm going to give half the throne to Varus, and Varus would take over. Even though the Parthians were in the middle of counterattacking, this is when they actually increased the counterattack, because they reasoned wrongly, no country can be ruled by a committee. If you've got a committee that has to decide on a battle plan, now's the time to strike. There can only be one general. So now in full force, the Parthians counterstruck. We're now up to the 35th Sanhedrin, starting with Moses, the 35th Sanhedrin, and up to Rabbi Judah the Prince. So now I'm going to stop for a minute. We've talked about Marcus Aurelius Antoninus and how he was a great friend. I'll just say another few sentences. Marcus Aurelius wanted to also consolidate the southern Levant, but not for the reason of Trajan and Hadrian. He had no problems with the southern Levant in terms of revolt. This was out of the question. He wanted to go to see what was so fantastic and so incredible about these people. He wanted to go and learn. He actually, later in life, wrote a book from all of his philosophy teachers. And my next-door neighbor, who was a Catholic, gave me a very early edition, a little red book that Marcus Aurelius Antoninus wrote about all of his philosophy. He names all of his teachers. And there's not even an allusion or a hint that Rabbi Judah the Prince was one of his teachers, even though we know that he was. And the reason was for obvious, because even if he had written that, by the time Constantine came there, there's no way that they would have left that in there. So that was redacted out by the church. But be that as it may, just like eventually the Talmud will be redacted. But in any case, Marcus Aurelius went and he met, when he was surveying the southern Levant, he met Rabbi Judah the Prince. And they became very good friends. And the Gemara tells many stories where he would come to him for advice, military advice, this advice, that advice. In fact, there's even one story where he sent a secret message. When you decode the message, because it doesn't make any sense, he's saying, I suspect my wife of adultery. How should I handle it? So he sent him back, Rabbi Judah the Prince sent him back advice on how to deal with his wife and so forth. So you can see now that the conditions have changed, that there is a pause in anti-Semitism. And so you can see how the conditions start to get together where a person could begin to put together the Mishnah. But I'm not taking that approach. I'm taking the approach from the personalities. So let me stop in the timeline and go back and finish the last of the personalities, and then we'll be ready for our next meeting to talk about the structure of the Mishnah itself and actually learn some. So we mentioned that one of the main scholars who was not a member of the family, meaning the lineage of Hillel, who was a Babylonian, but he was the line of David. And when he came to Israel, the Bnei Beisera, the people who were fine, upstanding men, but really had no rabbinical training per se, when they were dealing with difficult concepts about does the Sabbath put off the Passover, does the Passover push off the Sabbath, and so forth. So Hillel came and gave them the answer, and they were amazed. They'd been arguing left and right, and but they didn't believe him. Until he said, this is not my first trip here. I've been here before, and when I was here before, I learned from Shmai and Avtalon. And they said, did you say Shmai and Avtalon, our holy teachers? And they got up and they took off their cloaks and they said, you're in charge. And that's when Hillel was put in charge. So meantime, Hillel's first son, whose name was Shimon, who died a year or two later because Hillel lived to be 120. You imagine waiting for your inheritance and your father lives to be 120? Talk about bad luck. Okay, and so when his father died, so he lived. He was in charge for about a year or two. We know nothing more about him. He was talking about. He was taken over by Gamliel. Gamliel we know very little about. Gamliel the elder, the one who actually mentions him is New Testament because they're forced to. They have to explain how come it is that none of the rabbis said anything agreeable about Jesus. So there's one place where they say it's no evidence or anything, but they say Jesus said this, and Rabbi Gamliel didn't complain. That's the one time they mention the rabbis. That's the proof that all the rabbis agreed with Jesus. Okay, that's a tough sell, but that's neither here nor there. He was executed by the Romans. His son was Rav Shimon ben Gamliel. In the year 50, he was executed by the Romans. We know very little about him. Then we have Rav Gamliel of Yavne. That's the year 70. He was the one that brought everything back together. And his son was Rav Shimon Gamliel II. He's mentioned in all the Mishnahs that we're about to say. He's one of the early legal codifiers. And so that's Rav Shimon ben Gamliel. And it's his son, who's Rabbi Judah the Prince, who's going to put together the Mishnah. Rabbi Akiva, we mentioned, was the one who never lost an argument. The only argument he lost was Ben Azza, his son-in-law. And it says in the Gemara that he had an argument with his son-in-law. Anyway, Rabbi Akiva was the person that never lost an argument. He was a legal connoisseur. He knew the most, the best, the greatest of our entire history. There's one Gemara that says that there was an argument between Ben Azza, he died young, he never became a rabbi, and his father-in-law, Rabbi Akiva. And of course the rabbis wanted to do the best they could to get out of the way and let them argue back and forth. And in the end, it doesn't say that Ben Azza won, and it doesn't say that Rabbi Akiva agreed. It just says Rabbi Akiva was silent. And they all stood up and bursted in applause because finally, after 40 years, somebody had, I don't know if he really won or not, the law doesn't actually go like Ben Azza, but at least Rabbi Akiva was silenced. My personal view is he was trying to entice his son-in-law to reconnect with his daughter. That's my personal opinion. But in any case, this is the Rabbi Akiva, was a great, great, great sage. And Rabbi Akiva died, by one of the 10 martyrs, had his flesh with hot combs flayed off of him by the battle of Beitar and all of this, and so forth and so on. But when he was 120 years old, mind you. So the last of his disciples, we want to talk about them because this is going to lead into Rabbi Judah the Prince. So we have Rabbi Elazar ben Shemua, and so whenever it says Rabbi Elazar, it's talking about him. And originally he wasn't a student of Rabbi Akiva. He was a student of Rabbi Yosef Glili, which meant he knew a lot about Agarata. Rabbi Tarfon, which means he was strict, and he was from the teachings of Beis Shammai. In other words, he was very overly strict. And Rabbi Yoshua ben Hanania, that we mentioned before. And the other of the remaining disciples that he had, when I get to Rabbi Meir in a minute, so just relax, is Rabbi Yochanan the Sandler. Now, I want to take this point to mention in terms of Rabbi Ahrens and the comment that my lecture is out of date. So I'm going to I just want to preface by saying,
I was trying to
I
make
want
you
to
look good.
I want to preface now by saying the following: that
I feel terrible.
when Rabbi Bergstein asked me to speak, I said, "What's the topic?" And they gave me this topic. So I told you two lectures ago, I find this to be a very boring topic. I don't know anything about it. It's not my area of expertise. But if this is what the people want to talk about, I'll be happy to speak about it. And secondly, when I wrote this little document, the beginning of it is my own chiddush, and the rest of it goes according to Rabbi Art Scroll. Okay? But where am I getting my information from? So where I'm getting my information from is as follows. The main sources that we have for Jewish history, leaving out those things that are religious, which would be like Seder Olam and Darsa Rishonim, leaving out the religious, but going to the more historical, are the following, in terms of how the Mishnah came to be. First of all, in the 10th century, it's Rav Sharira Gaon, the Ageris of Rav Sharira Gaon. In other words, after the age of the Mishnah is the age of the Gemara. After the age of the Gemara is the age of the Rabbeinu Sabarai. After the age of the Rabbeinu Sabarai is about 500 years, the age of the Gionim, the geniuses. And after them are the Rishonim and the codifiers. And after them, the Acharonim. And we are the age after the war, after the Holocaust. Okay. So in any case, in the age of the Gionim, at the end of the age of the Gionim, in the 900s, Rabbi Sharira Gaon wrote an epistle where he was the head of the academy, and he recorded the whole history from Shimon HaTzadik all the way to his time, the 9th century. And our view of how Rabbi Judah the Prince put together and why he put it together is based, his point of view is one of the sources. And I'm going to get to what that meaning is in a minute. I'm just talking about now about being out of date. The second one is 200 years later by Maimonides. And his introduction to the Mishnah, Maimonides gives his view, which differs considerably from Rabbi Sharira Gaon. This is in the year in the 1200s, in the 1100s, the 12th century. And then shortly thereafter, Rabbi Avraham Ibn Dowd, or the Ravid, wrote a third history. Now, his Sefer Kabbalah was written for an entirely different reason. He wasn't here to answer your question, why do we have the Mishnah? He was here to write a book saying, how can we argue against the Karaites? The Karaites were an early sect of people who believed in the written Torah, but not the oral Torah. And so a lot of the current Jewish sects that have done away with the rabbis and want to take the Bible, the monopoly pieces, and interpret it their own way, are descendants of the belief system of the Karaites. In other words, we'll take the 5 books of Moses, maybe even the book of Joshua, but the rest of it, you can take it to the dunghill. It's got nothing to do with us. We don't need no stinking rabbis, and we don't need any interpretations. And so he wrote a response to the Karaites. And in so doing, in Sefer Kabbalah, he goes through the history of how Rabbi Judah the Prince got to write to Mishnah. So for those who say that it's...
So what is the difference?
I'm going to get to it in a minute. I'm a little bit ahead of me. We'll get to it in a minute. But so for those who say that what I'm saying is out of date, the answer is, well, yeah. I'm going back. My most recent source goes back to the 13th century, so I guess it is a little bit out of date. But here's a good example of what they do in modern times. The second of the disciples of Rabbi Akiva that I want to mention, that's going to feed into Rabbi Judah the Prince, is Rabbi Yochanan HaSandler, Rabbi Yochanan the sandal maker. You know, a lot of people don't know they can speak French. You can say garage, can't you? A lot of people don't know they can speak Hebrew. You can say the word sock, you know, a bag, a sack, okay? Well, a sandal. So you didn't know that you could speak Greek. Sandal is a Greek word. So Rabbi Yochanan is sandler. So in Jewish sources, it says that he was a sandal maker. Now there's a book called Sefer of Genealogies, Yuchsin. And in this book it says, no, he wasn't a sandal maker. He was a leather strap maker. You assumed, what did he use leather straps for the sandals? He used it for your...
We always learn sandal shoemaker.
Well, that's what the Gemara says. But in Sefer Yuchsin doesn't say that. They say that he made leather straps for your former profession for stringing pearls. The pearls were strung on them.
On leather?
Very thin strips of leather. Right. They didn't have nylon monofilament back then. So it was too expensive to use cotton. So this is what they used. So in modern day lectures, people actually get paid to give lectures, not me. Professionals, they bring in modern history and philology. So they say it's got nothing to do with any of this. Rabbi Yochanan Sandler, he was from Alexandria. Sandria. He was Alexandrian. That's called modern scholarship. This I don't know much about. So in any case, I only mention him just to get back at you. Okay. So finally, we have Rabbi Nehemiah. I'm only going to mention from one word, then I'm going to bring it more closely to our intent. Rabbi Nehemiah was famous for making the following statement. How will you know when the Messiah is about to arrive? He said, people will be chutzpahdik in person. Normally people are chutzpahdik in private. You know, you and me are arguing behind closed doors, we'll be chutzpahdik. But people will seek to go in front of the cameras to be brazen and chutzpahdik. Second of all, even honorable people will be devious. Even people who are lawyers will lie, cheat, and steal. And furthermore, the government will be people who are a class of elites that don't care about flyover country. Normally, the government cares about the flyover country because that's where the tax money comes from. These people won't even care about that. When you see these three things, you know Messiah is on the way. One last person I want to mention, then I'll get back to us, and that's just because I think it's funny. Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha. So Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha, it's very funny. He's only mentioned a couple times in the Mishna, but he lived to be 160 years old, 160. And Rabbi Judah the Prince, who's going to die in the year 190. So Rabbi Korcha was 150 years old at the time. And so finally, Rabbi Judah the Prince couldn't hold himself anymore, so he turned to me and how did you get to live so long? 150 years, how did you get to live so long? And his answer was, what, are you tired of seeing me? That was his answer. Are you tired of looking at me? And so I just, come on, it's funny. I can continue to cue you in to laugh. It's hilarious. You're tired of seeing me? So he said, nevertheless, tell me. So he says, the way I live so long, he says, I don't associate with people who do bad things. I don't associate myself with people who do bad things. Anyway, this brings us back to Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. So now we're talking about the Mishnah.
There's a question I want to ask you if you don't mind.
Yeah.
1 second about a translation. Why is Nasi translated into prince?
Because they don't want the Romans to think you're a king. Because that's, if I think you're a king, I will have to destroy you. That's why. In fact, I'll show you how bad it was. When Rabbi Judah the Prince died, and Marcus Aurelius Antoninus was gone, even though it's slightly before Constantine, the Christians were already having their impact, and anti-Semitism was always greatly on the uptake. So much so, his son had to be called not Nasi, but...
Nasir, I don't know.
Wasn't called the Nasi. What was his son called?
Exilarch.
Well, Nicaea, not Nasi. Instead of calling him Prince, they called him Prance. Well, they voweled it, they vocalized it wrong. Why? Because the Christians were starting to get the Romans interested again in the Jews, which, by the way, they won. In the year 350, Judaism was considered was made illegal, and the state of Israel ceased to exist in Roman history by the year 350. That's how it culminated with the effects of the Christians, and that's why the Jerusalem Talmud stopped in the year 350, whereas the Babylonian Talmud went on for another 140 years. Okay, so I'm not making this stuff up. I mean, it was serious stuff. So in any case, his son Nasi, he was called the Nasi, so he wouldn't be called the Malach, the Melech. So he wouldn't be called the king. Call him whatever you want. You call him bottle washer. As long as you don't refer to the government, the Romans didn't care. So he was called the Nasi.
Because a Nasi is a president.
That's a good word. That's a very good word. President is fine. King is not. Okay? And so, but by time...
Could have called him a president.
They could have, or a Chacham, or whatever they wanted. But the Romans didn't care. As long as you didn't call him Melech, we don't care. I'm saying it was so bad, they couldn't even call him Nasi anymore. In the next generation. His son wasn't even called Nasi.
Yet from the time of Moshe Rabbeinu.
I know that. That's why the Jews didn't mind using that term.
Right.
They didn't mind using it because we were familiar with the head of each tribe was the Nasi.
Otherwise they would have called him Melech.
No, they called him Mashiach. Each one called his rabbi Messiah. Why couldn't they call him King Messiah? Sure. So now we talked about the differences on how the approach to why it got put together. So the first interpretation, the general one given is Marcus Aurelius Antoninus was so friendly, there was a period of time of 40, 50 years that you could work interrupted and work on a project. How do you write War and Peace by Twitter? You can't do that. You want to write War and Peace, you need to have some elbow room. You need to tell people to pick up the phone, and you're not going to go to meetings. You need to have peace and quiet. So one answer is because you had time to do it. So there are two views. The Maimonides, which is the main view, our view, is what happened was that nothing was written down. It was an oral tradition on purpose. Now, it's true that maybe somebody might have jotted down a point or two, but this was only amongst the leaders. The person who wrote something down this was not allowed. In fact, if you'll go and dig up from antiquities, you'll never find a commentary on the Torah. If you'll dig up from antiquities, you'll never find fiction. Jewish people didn't have, we were dealing with real life. You'll never find fiction, okay, science fiction, or period. You'll find fragments of Tehillim, fragments of this, fragments of that, but nobody wrote. This is Maimonides' point of view in his introduction to the Mishnah. And so what did he do? What he did was, he was actually not the redactor, literally. He was not the mechaber, literally. The Rambam says he's called a chaver. He's called the one who brought it together, but it was his own divinely inspired ability to put all this together. Because all of the 7 main rabbis I spoke about last week and this week, last month and this month, they were all his teachers. And he was the last one to have all those 7 people with all those personalities and all those viewpoints. He was the last person. Now the Riva disagrees, and the Riva says Rabbi Ephes was the last one, but I'm not going to get into that in a minute. For right now, according to the Rambam, he was the last one who had all of these people as teachers. Everybody else had been killed off. Everybody else had been murderized by the Romans. Everybody else had been killed. This was the last living person of all of those teachers. And so Maimonides said he had the knowledge in his head. Yes, he had maybe a little note here, a note there, but he actually was the author. And as a result, today people look at the Mishnah and the oral Torah like they look at the 5 books of Moses of the written Torah. Meaning, I can tell you a Gemara where the 2 rabbis are having an argument, and so Rabbi A says to Rabbi B, what's your proof? He says, book of Exodus chapter 14, verse 3. And what's your proof? He says, in the book of Isaiah, he says, what? The book of what? He says, the book of Isaiah. And he doesn't even let him speak. He says to him, go back to the academy. When you can find a verse in the 5 books of Moses, come back and we'll talk. What are you bringing me a verse from the prophets for? There's nothing to be learned there in terms of law. That's custom or rabbinic rules. That's not law. So
he was the last one of...
Yeah, so what he did was...
Did he allege it on himself?
What? No. All of them were dead. They were all killed. There was nobody left.
Unanimously determined that he was the last one, or he said, I was the last one?
He didn't say anything. There wasn't anybody left. The academies were empty. There wasn't anybody else in charge. We'll talk about Kapar in a minute. Just give me a second. I can't say it all at once.
Maragoli says that everybody had written things that teach.
That is from Rabbi Shirira Gaon. I'm not up to him. I'm only up to the Rambam. And so here's the reason why this is important. Just like in the 5 books of Moses, how do we know that if you stole it and you made me chase you and I catch you, you have to pay a penalty, apart from going to jail and restitution? You have to pay a penalty because it says Haganif, the thief. Meaning, if I happen to stop you for a taillight and I find contraband, I might be able to put you in jail. I might be able to make you forced to pay restitution, but there's no penalty. Why? Because it says Haganif, you catch the thief. Or if a person comes in and says to the police, I stole this in my youth, I feel bad here, I'm giving it back. So, statute of limitation could put you in jail, but you had to make restitution. I can't say, you know what? I'm giving you a fine for having stolen it. You can't, because it says in the 5 books of Moses, Haganif, the thief. Meaning, if it's the thief, he pays a penalty. If it's not the thief, he goes to jail, he has a restitution, but no penalty. That's how exact we are in the 5 books of Moses. That's also exact how we are by the Mishnah. And nobody comes later can argue with it. Because Rabbi Huda Nasi had all of the 7 geniuses that I mentioned before. All the viewpoints, all the points of view. There was nothing left out. There's a phrase, you can't be smarter than the Gemara. He knew everything. And yes, there might have been a note or two here or there, but these were all ex officio. He put it together. That's what Maimonides says. And therefore we treat the Mishnah like it's divinely inspired. Period, paragraph. And nobody can come since the Mishnah, not the great sages of the Talmud, the rabbis here, nobody can come and argue rabbinical jurisprudence. You can argue the law and its application in this case, but you can't go back and rewrite the Constitution. You can't come back and say, this is not going to be the preamble of the Constitution. I decided that we're going to remove this from the preamble. You can't. You can come and make an amendment if you want. You can come and tell me that local statute if you want. You can tell me how it applies in today's world, but you can't go back and change rabbinical jurisprudence. Anyway, what was Rabbi Shlomo Sawilowsky's opinion? Rabbi Shlomo Sawilowsky said that's not what happened. He said, actually, Rabbi Akiva saw that destruction was on its way. And of course, he was smarter than anyone in the line of Hillel, except maybe Hillel himself. And so he began to write a compilation of the oral law. Everything that had happened since Shimon HaTzadik, the last of the Great Assembly, that was Alexander the Great's time, from about the year 380 till Rabbi Judah the Prince's time, for his 500-year period, because everything prior to that was recorded in our canon. You want to know the conversation? Go look in the book of Jeremiah. You want to know what they're talking about? Go look in the book of Ezekiel. You want to know what they're talking about? Go look about it in Song of Songs. Well, that period was over. It had been canonized already. So where are we taking all of the conversations and the stuff that happened since it was canonized? So, for instance, Rabbi Shimon HaTzadik, all the way to this period. So Rabbi Akiva said, I can see that the Romans are about to put an end to it. So he said he began to actually start writing this stuff up. And then he gave it over to one of his disciples. His main disciple was Rabbi Meir. And Rabbi Meir began to perfect all of this. Rabbi Meir was one of the 7 teachers of Rabbi Judah the Prince. And when Rabbi Judah the Prince put the 6 orders, the 60 tractates of the Mishna together, the general rule is that when you read a law, if it's unsigned, if it's anonymous, Stam Mishnah, if it's an anonymous Mishnah, it goes according to Rabbi Meir. Well, Rabbi Meir wasn't even a member of the family. He wasn't even part of Hillel's lineage. Why would it be according to him? Because according to Rabbi Shlomo Gaon, who wrote this in the 9th century, 200 years before Maimonides, that was the documents that Rabbi Judah the Prince had in front of him. He had all those documents. But he not only had those documents, which were the documents of the leaders, he also had the documents of the students. Now the problem with this is that every student walks away and he says, I think he said you're allowed to do it. And the other said, you're only allowed to do it on Tuesdays. Another guy said, no, you're only allowed to do it on Wednesdays. Another guy said, no, you're not allowed to do it all together. Another guy said, of course you're allowed to do it. Not only allowed to do it, you got to go out of your way to make sure you do it. So these minor notes, these minor pamphlets were floating around. And so what Rabbi Judah the Prince did, according to Rabbi Shlomo Gaon, was he brought all that in front of him and he went through to see which one of those were true to the teachings that he had received from all 7 of his teachers.
Okay, what's the source that you're now going to write down to the Shef Ksav? Yet I'll show you. Okay, so Rabbi Yehuda knows he had to come and said, Hashem, hey, favor to the Sefer. What's the source that you're not allowed to write down?
Because
what's the source of it? Where? Or was that also about that?
That is, if you phrase your question differently, it answers itself. It's like the debate I have with the rabbis on why you have to wash for pizza. First of all, when I was in yeshiva, we didn't wash for pizza. Right. Now they decide because we're so religious, this is bread. Okay, I think the baker would probably fall apart if you decide this was bread. And especially when they have something called thin pizza. In the old days of Sicily, I can see. Okay, so whenever the question of people ask the question the way you do, why do you have to wash for bread? Any rabbi who's ever been trained will answer the back and say on the contrary. You ask why do you have to wash for bread? Who says you don't have to wash for bread? Prove me that you don't have to. That's the way the approach they take. Now it didn't used to be that way in the 1970s. From Moses' time till 1970, if you wanted to eat pizza, it was mazonos. Okay, now if you wanted to eat more than 2 slices, you'd have to wash for bread because that's a meal. But this is just a snack, all right? Period. Okay, I can show you, I can name you the rabbis themselves that I saw eat pizza and made of mazonos. But they changed that around since 1970 because we became more religious. Your religiosity is increasing. And now instead of saying, who says you have to make a wash for bread, now the rabbis ask the question, who said you don't have to? So that I'm going to turn your question around in the same way. That's where I got it from. Where do you see that you're allowed to write it down? Because it says Moshe came off it didn't say Moshe came off the Mount Sinai and he wrote the following. It says he came off Sinai and he told. So I'm going to turn it around and say, you say, where do we decide that you're not allowed to? On the contrary, where do you see that you're allowed to write this down? That was the prevailing rule.
The normal thing would be, if you hear something, you're not sure if you will retain it, remember it, you write it down.
That's today.
You take notes.
That's today.
You take notes. That's the normal
but God
way
picked us because
so
we were stiff-necked.
There was something.
We spent.
You're not allowed to write it down. What's the look? I'm sure
so I'm answering you. For 40 years, they rehearsed this in the desert. They had nothing to do for 40 years. You should close that door. For 40 years, they didn't have any movies to go to. For 40 years, they didn't have YouTube to go to. They did nothing but study this. They didn't need to write down anything. And furthermore, they didn't have papyrus back in those days. They didn't have paper and pencil. So again, I maintain, on the contrary, where do we see anywhere that they did write it down? Nehemiah chapter 8, verse 8 is the first time where we see that that when the Jews came back from Babylon after being there for a mere 7 years, they couldn't speak Hebrew. They didn't know the translation of Shalom Aleichem Rebbe, which is not Shalom Aleichem Rebbe, because that's plural. You must have more than one Rebbe. Even that's wrong. But in or they talk about Shabbosin, like it's a masculine term. And so that's the kind of Hebrew they were speaking. So when Ezra was standing there before them and speaking to him, this is what he said, and this is what they heard. So what on earth is he talking about? So they turned to this, well, how are we supposed to? What are we supposed to? And so Nehemiah, they said, they tell you what, you can make a parish. It's allowed. Because till now, no one said you could. It's not who said you can't. No one said you could. That's now. I'm talking about then.
But then
after.
That's when it started that the Torah Shabbat passed.
After.
The Torah Shabbat you were not allowed to say. People think that's why when the Rebbe would quote a puzzle,
he'd always look inside the sefer. You're not allowed to say it by heart. That's
he
only.
would say it incorrectly.
Or I know I know this. I always argued. I always came back from every upbringing and I said, why does the Rebbe keep saying Bereshis Bar Elokim Es Hashemayim Ves Haaretz? It doesn't say that. It's Bereshis Bar Elokim Es Hashemayim Ves Haaretz. Why does he keep saying Es? And so first they said, well, it's Yiddish. And I said, I don't accept that. And then they said what you just said. But this is the way we talk.
But that means that you're not supposed to.
This is the way we talk after Rabbi Judah the Prince did this. We're talking about the question of what happened beforehand. It's two different things. But anyway, getting back to us. So something I wanted to add. Because we are different. I had this argument once with Indiana Jones.
And?
He was, his name was Professor Strange. Professor Strange. So he was giving a lecture at University of South Florida where I was doing my PhD.
Yeah.
And Professor Strange was wanted in every Middle Eastern country for stealing their artifacts. Right. But he never actually stole them for himself. He gave them the Smithsonian, this kind of thing. So he was there and he was speaking to the ladies, the tea group, about his latest finds. And he was a swashbuckler. He was an Indiana Jones.
Yeah.
Okay. And so I was there for 3 seconds. I knew he was a fake. When he started saying that he was reading in this Hebrew document, I don't know what language he was speaking, but it wasn't Hebrew. So he was obviously faking, but they didn't know. The ladies didn't know of the tea. I'm not saying it derogatorily. It was a group of ladies that had an organization for teas. I don't know why ladies do this, but they did tea. It was a tea group. They met for tea.
Drinking tea?
Yeah, drinking tea. And so
why?
So I'm answering. So in any case, so he said, I can't remember exactly what it is. And by the way, I have a mezuzah like this. I'll bring it next time someone reminds me. I have a mezuzah that said God is a fireball. Great balls of fire. I have a mezuzah that right inside the mezuzah calls God a great ball of fire. It's a mistake. And in any case, so he's had this whole long opinion, whatever it was, how the sea split, how the whatever it was. Okay, and he had this whole ridiculous thing, and they're all listening. This is amazing. This is fantastic. Based on this document we found, I'm going to answer your question. So he says, any questions? I'm in the back of the room, the only not woman there. And so he says, well, what are you here for? I was just a doctoral student. I wanted to go here. And I said, well, is there any chance at all, that you found this document in a leather pouch? And he said, yes. I said, is there any chance, I mean, I don't know, that the leather pouch was inside of a clay pot? He said, how'd you know? I said, is there any chance that you had to dig underground into a cave to find it? He said, were you there with us? I don't remember you. How did you know? And so I said to him, Geniza. And he said, Gesundheit. And I said, no, Geniza. And he said, Gesundheit. I said, don't you know what Geniza is? And he said, no. I said, a Geniza is a place where they bury documents. Now, let me ask you a question for his purposes and now your purposes. What's more likely to survive 2,000 years? A document that was written that they used every day? Or a document that they wrote and they made a mistake and so they buried it? Which one's going to last? So he says, obviously, one that never got used. I said, right. So the document that you found, no one's denying that you found a document. But the whole story that you're creating by this era, the reason why it was buried in Geniza is because we're Jews. We're so stiff-necked. We made a religion out of us. We don't even do this. We don't even do that. We bury it like dead people. We actually have a funeral procession, and we cry, and we bury it. Today, of course, we don't use leather pouches, for the record. We don't use clay pots. We use baggies. Okay, but nevertheless, modern times. But so I said to him, so basically what you found was an error, and that's why it was buried. And his answer to me was, and what's your point? Okay, never mind. If you can't figure out what my point is. But what am I saying to you? My point is that if it got used, why should it exist? The only things that exist now are the mistakes. Anyway, I wanted to say something else, but we got off track. So I just want to mention, because we're going to speak next time about the Mishna itself, I want to talk about the fact that even though we today, amongst the religious, the Orthodox, hold the Mishnah to have the same sanctity per se as the Chumash, at least in terms of being exact, it's not quite that simple. Because you know, obviously, that in the Mishnah itself, that Rabbi Judah Prince draws upon any of his 7 teachers, and they drew upon those great sages before them, and sometimes there are differences of opinion, and of course it goes, if there's a Sanhedrin, by a majority vote, but when he wrote the Mishnah, he decided himself what the majority vote was, and generally is according to his teacher Rabbi Meir, but occasionally not. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yossi, and so forth and so on. Secondly, you should know that he wasn't the only one to do this.
Many people.
A lot of people don't know that, for example, Bar Kapara, who never got ordained, also wrote a Mishnah.
Bar
Kapara. He never got ordained. Bar Kapara, I'm finishing 1 minute.
With a kuf or with a kaf?
With a kuf.
Okay.
Bar Kapara wrote a Mishnah, and he had an independent academy. Now, he was always a younger man, but he was always in the thorn of Rabbi Judah the Prince, always. One time, he went to a dinner, and Rabbi Judah the Prince's son-in-law was not religious, always felt bad because he couldn't participate in the rabbinical conversations. So he asked him to, Bar Kapara, I wish I could join in. So he said, well, why don't you ask your father-in-law the following riddle? And I'm not going to go into the details, but basically he asked him the question, why can't the Jews afford to give the priests their 24 gifts? And the answer is, being the Nasi, he was a tax collector, and he was a tax and spend Democrat like King Solomon was, and people couldn't afford it. People were broke because the Nasi kept raising taxes to pay off the Romans. And so the reason why people couldn't be Jewish and do Jewish things is because they were paying so much for taxes. So that was the riddle. So immediately, Rabbi Judah the Prince knew that this didn't come from his son-in-law, and he looked at Kapara, but Kapara had his own academy, and basically didn't ordain him. They never speaking. They were speaking. In fact, when Rabbi Judah the Prince died, the one who reported it to everybody was Bar Kapara. Bar Kapara held him in high esteem. But in any case, Bar Kapara wrote his own Mishnayos. Now, it doesn't exist anymore, and the only way we know about it, we say Tana Bar Kapara, is because it's included in the Brises, and I'll explain what the Brises are next time we meet. So the only reason we know about it, because excerpts of it are still extant. 2 more little brief points and I'm done. The second point was, when the prophet got finished prophesying, giving his prophecy, while he was giving his prophecy, anybody who said different got zapped. But 2 seconds after the prophet got finished speaking, he was a regular person. And if you wanted to debate with him what it meant, he was just a regular person. He got 1 man, 1 vote. Same thing with the Lubavitcher Rebbe. There's many stories about how first Lubavitcher Rebbe used to give a lecture, and afterwards the people would discuss it together, and there was a debate. And they weren't sure what it meant, so they went up and sent someone up to speak to the first Lubavitcher Rebbe to ask him, was it this way or that way? And it was taking a while, so they went up the stairs to listen. They hear yelling and screaming and back and forth and this and that and yo mama and left and right. And so, what's going on? And so the guy came out and he says, okay, the answer is like this. And they said, we don't care about that anymore. What were you doing arguing with the Rebbe? How could you talk to the Alter Rebbe like this? And he says, when the Alter Rebbe is teaching it, then he's the Alter Rebbe. But afterwards, when it comes to its application, he's 1 man, 1 vote.
I wasn't saying a maimer.
What?
A maimer is at the time of giving over the maimer, so that's
that you can't argue.
Given
That's the equivalent of a prophet prophesying.
Okay.
I know. So okay, And furthermore, we have, after Rabbi Judah, the last point, Rabbi Judah the Prince, after his time period, there were transition rabbis, Tanahu Palig. They were transition rabbis who were not students of Rebbe's teachers, the 7 teachers, but they were students of Rebbe himself. This would be like Rav, his uncle Rabbi Chia, Rabbi Shaya Rabbah, certain people who were transition rabbis. And you'll find many times in the Mishnah that, of course, they hold by the Mishnah, but they teach it differently. That they look at the Mishnah and say, that's not authentic. That's not what Rebbe said. Today, when we want to know we go to the bookstore, and that's what it's written, and that's the way it is. But in those days, it wasn't written down, and so there were people who came later, within the next 20, 30 years, between the year up to year 200, 210 of the Common Era, they said, I know what the Mishnah is, and that's not it. Or in Rav's case, in some cases, like Rav will be arguing with Shmuel, and when Shmuel gives his argument, the Gemara will spend 5 pages to find out how could Shmuel possibly have this opinion. But they don't go and ask, what about Rav's opinion? How could he say this? The answer is he has the authority that if he wants to read it that way, he belongs to the previous generation. So with all of this preface, next time, if there is a next time, we'll actually take a Mishnah.
What do you mean if there's a next time?
Well, I'll have to be invited. If there is, and next time I'll actually
You're already
comb my hair. Now that I know it's being videotaped, I'll take a shower. I'll brush my teeth. I'll use deodorant. That's why everybody's sitting on that side.
We can't smell on TV.
Well, okay, but people are sitting on that side. So next time we'll actually take a Mishnah. I'll bring you a copy in Hebrew and English, and we'll take a look at its structure, and we'll talk about what its purpose is and how we learn it. Okay, folks, enjoy.